have a real live event taking place right now that we might test this theory against and start off by asking ourselves how we think about it. Elections took place in the Gaza Strip, and Hamas was elected into power, or we presume into power, at 76 seats out of 135. The United States has been very insistent that the Palestinian Authority be more democratic. And so it, in a sense, got what it wanted, which was the voice of the people. But the entity elected is a group that refuses to recognize Israel, has pledged its destruction, refuses to disband, and still is named a terrorist organization, not just by the United States, but by the European Union and many other groups outside as well. So, let me begin by asking His Excellency, the President of Afghanistan, what would you think, how should we think about this issue of promoting democracy and arriving at a process in which a group like Hamas ends up in power? Should we applaud this? Is this a mark of progress in the Palestinian territories?
Sir, democracy is the most accepted form of government around the world, and one that people generally like all over the world. Individuals in most countries would aspire to it. Now, democracy also has, for those who win it by vote as governments, responsibilities coming upon those that have won. Since the question is specific to Hamas, I would like to go there straight. I would accept Hamas's winning of elections out of the free will of the Palestinian people. After all, democracy is to respect the will of the people. But that will of the Palestinian people expressed in the form of voting for Hamas also becomes Hamas's responsibility in turn to respect that vote, the confidence of the Palestinian people. Now, as an observer from outside, and as a human being myself, all human beings have aspirations. If I were a Palestinian, what would I want? I would want peace. I would want a better living. I would want security for my children, and I would want a guarantee for my future, for the generations that come. How do we as Palestinians reach there? Is it possible to gain security and peace in conflict with Israel? Is it possible to do away with Israel? And if I put myself again as a Palestinian, no. Therefore, for Hamas, in order to fulfill the desires of the Palestinian people, it's imperative, it's a must to speak with Israel, to engage with Israel, and to seek peace through engagement with Israel. This is the political aspect of things. There is also, for me, not as the president of Afghanistan, but as a citizen of the world, as a human being, a great moral side to this question. Morality of man would strongly reject a call for the extension of a nation, the removal of a people. I would urge Hamas, as if I were Palestinian, also as a citizen of the world, that they do away with the talk of not accepting Israel or asking for the extinction of Israel. It's not the right moral thing to do. Israelis are people like we are, like the Palestinians are. They have families, they have children, they have life. You never wish a child to go away. you enjoy the sight of a child, wherever that child may be. In the same manner, I would ask Israel to work with the Palestinian people. Palestinians also have families and children in life like the Israelis have, and to accept the state of Palestine as a reality that has to come without a legitimate role for the Palestinian people, for the creation of the state of Palestine. There will not be peace in that part of the world. So I want a Palestinian state. I want Israel to live there. So Hamas has to speak with Israel, has to recognize that will be, in fact, fulfilling the aspiration of the Palestinian people as I see it. Therefore, democracy works well in this case.
Prince Turki, let me ask you a variation on this question. Is this not a terrible indictment of Arafat and his organization that Arab states have backed for so many decades? Here you had a chance for the Palestinian people to vote, and a party, an organization that claimed to be representing them as their liberators, at the moment of liberation, collapses and is thoroughly rejected by its people. It would be as if the Indian National Congress in 1947 were voted out of office, or the African National Congress, upon the end of apartheid, were voted out of existence. It is an extraordinary indictment of the corruption and mismanagement and the lack of basic delivery of the secular or so-called secular Fatah organization that seems to have opened up space for Hamas.
I think all of these things are true, but they're not the only reasons for the fate of Fatah in these elections. I believe the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and in Gaza until they withdrew led in many cases to Fatah's destruction. We've seen the onslaught on the Palestinian Authority's infrastructure, whether it was in roads, hospitals, schools, even the security apparatus that would have presumably been able to prevent the acts that were undertaken by the Islamist movements in Palestine, like Jihad and Hamas. In the final analysis, the Palestinian Authority could not even provide personal security for its citizens. And so it is not just the corruption and the mismanagement that Fatah is responsible for, but also I think the fact that the Israelis, when Mahmoud Abbas particularly became president, did not give him the wherewithal to do the things that he wanted to do. There is no individual person in Palestine who could have been tailor-made for the peace process than Mahmoud Abbas. His courage in expressing his opposition to an armed struggle speaks for that being tailor-made for peace in Palestine. He tried his best to convince the Israelis that they must give him something to show his people that he is accomplishing something. The prisoners in Israeli jails were not allowed to go home. The barriers that the Israelis imposed all over Palestine prevented people from getting to their work and their livelihoods. And the list is on and on and on and on. So along with the corruption and the mismanagement, there is the other side as well, where the Israelis did not allow for Fatah or Mahmoud Abbas in particular to provide the kind of services that the Palestinian people needed. And when people are desperate, they tend to turn towards maximalist promoters. Hamas appealed to that sentiment in these elections and was successful. And we've seen how much of a high vote that they got in the elections. That does not mean, as your statement said, Mr. Zakaria, that Yasser Arafat is not to blame for that. He is dead and gone now, and I think his legacy will still be decided by the Palestinian people in the future. But the fact is that the situation in Palestine did not allow for an even-handed contest between Fatah and Hamas. Hamas appealed, as I said, to these maximalist attitudes in the Palestinian people, but they had not had any responsibility before. So they don't have a track record of how they will deal with things. Now is the time that Hamas will begin to be judged by the actions that it takes. And in the primary case, they have to provide the Palestinian people with the opportunity for peace, for harmony, and for livelihood.
You spoke of the even-handed, the uneven contest, in a sense, between Fatah and Hamas, and I want to ask Assam, how does this contest play itself out? Because a few months ago we saw in Egypt a similar circumstance. An election takes place, and in a scenario that is scarily reminiscent of one that has been playing on for decades in the Arab world, a secular regime decides that it will turn its full fury on the secular liberal opposition, crush it as strongly as it can, leave the Islamist opposition, and then present the West with a choice and say, it's either us or these guys with beards. You choose. And in that circumstance, of course, people recoil, and it empowers the Islamists and it empowers the regime in place. Is this dynamic one that provides these Islamic parties with more space than they would normally have?
Well, what are the alternatives? One of the alternatives is not to hold elections, which means to stop the democracy from... this would be terrible. In the Palestinian case, they have had elections in January 1996, and for 10 years they were waiting for a new opportunity to express themselves. So you cannot just say no election. Another alternative is to say, well, those we don't like should not run in these elections. And I have heard this very often before the Palestinian elections, people who wanted to exclude Hamas or exclude others. But now we know that by excluding Hamas from running in these elections, you would have excluded half of the Palestinian population, or at least half of the Palestinian electorate. So there are no alternative than holding the elections and calling on everybody to compete. I do believe that Hamas' decision this time not to boycott the election is a very positive news for democracy, because Hamas has boycotted the 1996 elections and also the presidential election of last year. So this is a good news that a group that has been outside the political process has joined the political process. The other good news is that there has been a huge turnout in these elections. I mean, people were not scared from participating. On the contrary, they were enthusiastic. And to a large extent, the election was a model election in terms of its organization, its technical. So these are good news, and we should not forget them. Now, how will Hamas evolve in the... Well, people voted certainly against corruption, as His Highness said, and against a huge public sector made of 165,000 civil servants with corruption and very low level of efficiency and all the rest. 65,000 people in the security services, but no security for the people in the West Bank and Gaza. But they also voted against the very slow motion of the peace process. People are desperate to get results. And in the past 10 years or 13 years since Oslo, the Palestinians have been waiting for the magical moment where they can, at last, have a right to self-determination. And they haven't had it until now. So to a large extent, they are also voting against the slow motion of this peace process, and they are calling by this vote for the international community to be more active in pressing for the withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza and the building of a Palestinian state, which is, in my view at least, the very condition for stability in that part of the world. So this vote has a huge political meaning.
But Qassem, let me just interrupt you. They're voting in favor of an accelerated peace process by voting for a party that completely rejects the peace process, rejects Israel, and rejects any negotiated process.
Farid, exactly a year ago, a huge majority of Palestinians voted for Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, who is in the Palestinian leadership, the most engaged in reaching a peace agreement with Israel. and the same majority voted today for Hamas. These are the same people. This is not another people. The Palestinian people has not changed in 1 year. What the Palestinian people wants is to reach a Palestinian statehood. Through Mahmoud Abbas, if he can convince the Israelis and the international community that this is urgent, and through Hamas, if this sends a clear message to the international community. So this is not another Palestinian people who voted for Hamas last year and for Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas last year, and for Hamas this year. It is the same Palestinian people in different languages, using different means, calling on different people, but for the same purpose, Palestinian statehood as soon as possible.
So Governor Owen, let me ask you, the United States has made this push for democracy the centerpiece of its foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, specifically in the case of the Palestinians. It now faces the reality. What does it do? It has said it will not deal with Hamas in the past. It has said that it will not deal with an organization that does not recognize Israel, that will not renounce arms. Hamas has made it clear, at least so far, none of its platform changes. So you're advising your friend George Bush. What do you tell him?
Well, the president has many advisors who are more expert in this subject than am I, and the president and the Secretary of State have spoken in the last few days directly and indirectly on this issue. I would make a couple of observations. First, Hamas will probably change. With the 70% mandate, and now it actually has to start solving problems instead of being on the outside critiquing, it's now going to be held responsible for doing what it said it would do. Much of that platform was economic. Much of that platform was security. Much of that platform was to address the failings of that Palestinian state, which hadn't been addressed by its earlier leadership. And so the buck is really going to stop with Hamas, and my prediction is that it is going to have to become more moderate in order to solve the real problems that it faces. I'd like to make a second point, and with respect to my friend the Prince, who's been such a friend of the United States, who mentioned that Israel had perhaps been responsible for, to some extent, for Fatah's defeat. You know, Israel gets blamed for a lot of failures in the Mideast. It's not unusual that states and people point to Israel as the reason for things having happened. But with respect, I would suggest that Palestinian leadership for 20 or 30 years had failed. That instead of trying to build up the Palestinian economy, trying to raise that boat, leadership decided we're going to keep this country in turmoil. We're going to keep this land in turmoil because that's better to stay on war footing. I think there's a lot of evidence of that. And if Hamas would simply start to develop the economy and start to improve the people's lives, I think that you would see it stay in power. But I think the window is very short. One final point. It is surprising when that which we think is going to occur doesn't occur. Everybody assumed that after 40 years that perhaps there might be a continuation, but that earlier regime was illegitimate, and it reminds me of the fall of the Soviet Union. John Kenneth Galbraith was telling us in 1985 that if an election were allowed to be held in the Soviet Union, it was clear that the Communist Party would win an overwhelming majority. Well, 5, 6, 7 years later, there actually were a series of sort of elections, and the rest is history.
But specifically, you would deal with Hamas?
You know, obviously the president speaks for my country. I would wait a few days, weeks to see what Hamas says. And obviously governors don't make foreign policy, but Hamas is the elected leadership, and if we believe in democracy, you have to respect that. But I think also we need to wait and see what their actions are as opposed to what their words were before the election.
President Karzai, you have some experience, and let's broaden the discussion, with armed groups that have chosen to enter the democratic process. How difficult is it to How do you go about that task? You have warlords, you still have militias, you're still in the process of demobilizing it. There are people who say, as you know, that while you are a great man, your writ really runs around Kabul, and that beyond that, it is still a land ruled by warlords. How do you use the democratic process to consolidate power rather than allow it to be captured by various groups outside?
Well, I'll go a bit into the history. Afghanistan had a disastrous war of liberation against the former Soviet Union. And then Afghanistan had an even worse situation in trying to liberate itself from the rule of the Taliban and terrorism. While Afghanistan was struggling for its survival, there was this massive desire in the Afghan people to re-own their country and to have a secure, decent life. But Afghanistan was incapacitated by years of war and intervention, and that incapacitation took its ability away from getting what it wanted. It needed international intervention. The intervention came after September 11, and the joining of hands of the international community with the desire of the Afghan people produced for us what we have today: democracy, reconstruction, relative stability, and all that. Now, there were various groups fighting the Soviets. There were various groups fighting the Taliban. They had arms. Once the country presented a different opportunity to them to participate and build the country, they took that opportunity. The people that generally are referred to as warlords are now in the Afghan parliament. The people that are generally referred to as armed political parties are now part of the Afghan parliament. Democracy plays wonders. Today in the Afghan parliament, we have groups that were killing each other 20 years ago. Today we have former communists who were chasing the Mujahideen out of the country. Today we have the Mujahideen who are fighting the Soviets in the parliament. Today we have women represented in the parliament who were shunned away from the society by the Taliban, who were kept at home, who were not allowed to work. So given opportunity to those that want to have it is the best thing. And the Afghan people wanted to have this opportunity. The opportunity is taken by all, and it has proven to be right. Today in the Afghan parliament, we have 28% women. We have former Mujahideen, former commanders with guns, tribal chiefs, clergy, even two Taliban. Even the Taliban began to participate in the process. Two of them have won elections, former communists. So this exercise of democratic rule has worked for Afghanistan, has worked very, very well for Afghanistan. With regard to the rule of the government, my own rule as the president of Afghanistan, yes, there is a lot of story in the press that Karzai does not rule beyond Kabul. And if you look at it from here or from Washington or from London or Paris, perhaps it would look like that. But inside Afghanistan, the political authority of the current government runs to the farthest corner of the country. The political authority must be very careful here. We are politically legitimate, strong and present, can dismiss any government official, can appoint anyone to any part of the country. Where we are limited is in the ability to deliver services to the Afghan people because of lack of human resources, because of lack of good administration, and for obvious reasons of war. So in terms of services, our limitation is serious, but in terms of our political presence and legitimacy, it's massive and strong.
When you were talking about the people who have come into the Afghan parliament, the demobilization of militias, has that in your experience been successful, and what is the key? Because of course this is going to be an issue for Hamas as well.
Good question, very relevant question. We had thousands of armed groups and people. We had heavy weapons in the hands of these groups. In the past 4 years, we have collected almost the entire armory of heavy weapons from these groups. We have also collected medium-sized heavy weapons, the heavy machine guns. We are now beginning a process called DIAG, disarming unofficial armed persons or groups, and that will take a number of years to go. But the DDR process, which is disarming, demobilizing, and reintegrating former combatants, that has been completed successfully with the collection of thousands and thousands of weapons, with reintegration of great many of them into the society. Now is the phase to go after the weapons that lie in villages and towns and suburban areas with unofficial armed groups. That process has begun. Let's see how that will work forward.
Ghassem, how does it strike you? Right now what you have is Hamas having won. Now Hamas has to do what we kept asking Fatah to do, which is disarm all the Palestinian militias, which means Hamas has to disarm Fatah. I cannot imagine this will be an easy process. The Fatah will not agree to disarm. It is particularly difficult, it seems to me, because Hamas has always argued against the principle of disarming private militias. So it now has to go back on the principle, plus it has to find in a very decentralized security atmosphere, 12 competing militias within Fatah, a process which will make it happen. Can this happen, or are we going to watch some kind of a power struggle, an armed power struggle between Fatah and Hamas?
This is a possibility, I don't rule out. However, I would say, ask for the impossible and you will get chaos. Ask for Hamas and Fatah now to disarm and you will get chaos. The way, if you start doing it, you will get chaos as well. I do believe we need a wise transitional period in which everybody reviews his positions. My own hope is that President Abbas remains in his position, that negotiation with Israel will be left to him for the time being, that some form of agreement for cohabitation between the new majority and the president is organized soon, where the president and Hamas come to sort of select a foreign minister and an interior minister that are agreed upon by the two sides. I hope that Hamas will be accepted in the Arab family through a clear statement of acceptance of the Beirut Arab Summit resolutions of 2002, where there is a clear Arab offer for recognition versus withdrawal. And if Hamas does this, after the huge step it has already done by not boycotting the elections and by playing by the rules, this would be another step. So let's look for incremental steps. And I am a bit worried about those who now want to somehow play the financial card against the new Palestinian majority. You'll not get a penny if you don't do this immediately. I do believe asking for impossible tasks right now is really preaching for chaos. An incremental, gradual approach is the one everybody needs right now.
Okay. Let's keep broadening it. President Karzai spoke very eloquently about the power of democracy and the power of democracy to bring people together, to bring former enemies together, to create a national process. Your Royal Highness, you're listening to this and you want to try it in Saudi Arabia?
First of all, let me just return to what the governor said about basically we are seeing Israeli hands in everything that happens in Palestine or anywhere else. If I accept that, I hope the governor will accept that with many officials in America, they simply don't see any Israeli hand in anything that happens in the Arab and Palestinian problem. And that is a problem, I think, that in as much as we recognize that the Palestinian Authority had failed in its mission of bringing independence to the Palestinians, Israeli occupation of Palestine also equally is to blame for that. As far as trying democracy is concerned, I think democracy has become a sort of religious calling that is promoted by the United States and European countries who practice democracy and would like to see it spread to other countries in the view and in the belief, of course, that because their experience with that particular system of government has led them to a certain level of social coherence and political responsibility and so on, that perhaps others should also try the same method. I cannot argue with that because I think there is merit to that argument. But also, I think each country and each people have to work their way through a process of reaching that level of particularly people's responsibility towards themselves. Participation of people in government is what is required because they have to take on the mantle of that responsibility, and I think no one in the Arab or Muslim world today will disagree with that point of view. But how to get there? Is American democracy a good example for us to follow? I think in some cases it is. One of the things that I see very laudable about American democracy is the fact that they're so wide open on everything. There is no secrecy in America. Everything in the final analysis is laid bare before the electorate. And the electorate in the final analysis makes a judgment on the issues that are concerning the American people. And also another laudable factor, I think, in the American system and perhaps in other democratic systems is the fact that people have a chance to change their view about their leaders every once in a while. There is a systematic process. In America, it is 4 years. In other countries, it is longer or shorter, and so on. And all of these things, I think, are laudable and promote the accountability that governments have to practice to the people. And as such, I think a country like Saudi Arabia, which is just starting on the road of wider political participation and engaging the social makeup of the kingdom in the political process, these are things that we should learn. But I think there are negatives as well to democratic practice, whether in America or in Europe. What we see of political corruption and the buying of influence and the spread of influence peddling, whether it is in Congress or in the administration or in other, despite the fact that everything is out in the open. What we see of perhaps that elections are not necessarily decided by a majority vote. And if you remember 2000, Mr. Gore received more popular votes than Mr. Bush. But because America accepted a system of electoral college as a decider in that, and because that came about as a result of the will of the people, then they accept, Americans, that Mr. Bush was the legitimate president. And all these things for countries like Saudi Arabia to learn and to go through, we hope that we don't fall in the pitfalls and so on that others have fallen into before us. So yes, we have much to learn and much to gain, but it is not a blanket adoption of other people's systems of government that we want to take on. We want to tailor-make our own system of government for our needs. And one point that you have not yet really gotten into, Mr. Zakaria, is the fact of religion in politics. And coming from a country that practices that wholeheartedly, I can see where people have a problem with that issue, particularly in the West. But what I also see is that in a country like the United States, religion also has become part and parcel of politics. And whether that is laudable or not, I can't say. But these are realities that we in the kingdom have to look at and face and learn from and develop our own way through that.
Well, the way you describe it, Prince Turki, it is a slow process of evolution. But explain to us why it would be necessary then to punish people who merely speak out in the most moderate and measured terms as did a group of Saudi citizens when asking for the possible consideration of a political system that might eventually be a constitutional monarchy. Now, you have, if I may say so, crazy religious types who will say things that are extremely intemperate and extreme, not just against the West, but against your own regime. And those people are rarely silenced. Those people are bought off in many cases. But when a liberal critic of the regime speaks out, even if in the most measured and respectful terms, they are hauled off to jail, they're not given lawyers. I realized that this was reversed recently and they were freed. But this entire process surely sends a chill down any group of people who think about modernizing their country.
These specific people that you talk about went through a process, what in the West is called due process. There was an accusation brought against them by the Attorney General in Saudi Arabia about their incitement of fitna, which is a very considered a very big crime in Islamic jurisprudence. Fitna generally means bringing dissension and disturbance to the social harmony. And they went through the court system. They had representation, and I correct you on that. And through that process, a sentence was passed on them. But in the final analysis, the king released them from jail with clemency. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind, a country like Saudi Arabia, as I said, is a country that is developing itself and going into institution building and so on. We don't claim for ourselves to be angels, nor do we claim that we have perfected either a judicial system or a social system or a political system. Reminders of what happened in the vanguard of Western democracy, whether in Europe or in America, of all of the misdeeds and infringement on people's rights and so on throughout the history of countries like the United States or Great Britain or France or other countries, are in the experience of these people. In America, they went to civil war over issues that had to do with problems of establishing institutions and whether they accept racial differences and people becoming slaves or not. In England, they went through many crises in order to reach the level that they have reached now. We are learning and we will commit mistakes, but the recourse in our case is that the Imam of the Ummah, or the king in our instance, can rectify miscarriages of justice. And by that recourse, the problem we have with that is that it is not yet institutionalized. It is still based on an individual who has the responsibility of directing the welfare of the people. But we're willing to learn from our mistakes. And if you see now, the kingdom has changed dramatically in the last 10 years over such issues as personal rights or personal freedom or freedom of the press, or what we call national dialogue, where people are brought to discuss even the most sensitive issues, like representation in government, like the openness and the accountability of government, like sectarian differences, and so on. So that process of learning is underway, and I hope it will take us forward to a time when we can compete on an even level with other countries.
Let me throw it open to the audience now. If people, somebody have mics handy? Yeah. Sir, in the middle there. Short question.
Yes, short. This is addressed to Prince Turki. Democracy is not just a process of governance. It is about the aspirations of people, and particularly the fundamental aspiration of freedom and choice. Are we then saying here that some sets of people around the world do not want it?
I don't know. I think there probably are, and not just in our country. I think if you look at general trends in the voting of people, in whether it is in Europe or in other places, the participation, and these are societies that have been practicing democracy for a long time, is going down. The numbers of people who are not voting is increasing and not decreasing. The opposite is true in nascent democracies that are coming up now. The Palestinians just recently went with, I don't know how many, 70, 80% of their population. In Iraq, it was huge numbers that participated. So whether it is the novelty of the experience that gives people the push to participate more, and then as they grow more practiced with that system, they become disenchanted with it and care less about expressing their view, it could be. But you're asking the wrong person. I'm not the one who has the experience to talk about these things.
And perhaps one day the Saudi people will let us know what they would like.
Well, indeed.
Dominique Bromberger, France Inter Radio. Question for Governor Owens. We have been told during those last 3 days that if money was stopped next week to the Palestinian territories, money coming from tax money coming from Israel or money coming from the European Union or from the United States, there will be chaos next week in the Palestinian territories. What would be not your advice to the president, because you are not going to be asked for that, but your personal view on this question?
To make sure I understand the question, and I've read headlines about this issue, people are discussing keeping financial aid from reaching the new government. Fareed, can you?
Right. The budget of the Palestinian Authority almost entirely comes from the three sources he mentioned: Israeli tax monies, EU grants, and US grants.
Again, obviously, I don't speak for my government. What I would do is very tentatively watch what Hamas does as opposed to what Hamas said it would do. There is a very, very moderating thing that happens when you have to take power and take responsibility, as the president and the prince had earlier mentioned. And I do believe in democracy, and I do believe in people's rights to make mistakes. We do it in our country, and most countries make mistakes through the democratic process. These mistakes typically self-regulate in the next cycle. Hamas now has to face the fact that it has to perform. And so if it were driven to be able to blame outsiders for its failure because of the drying up of resources, I think it would be able to avoid the responsibility of acting moderately and moving towards solving the problem. Again, I don't know what these powers, what their decision might be. If I were making that judgment, I would see what the new government does and would use those resources to try to help steer that government in a moderate direction.
Prince Turki, you wanted to briefly...
Just a small reminder to everybody that Hamas is on the terrorist list in the United States. And as such, there are automatic laws that take over on issues of money disbursement and collection for Hamas. So a country like Saudi Arabia that would now like to contribute to the Palestinian Authority might be liable to American law because of these institutionalized constrictions that the American legal system has put on an organization like Hamas. And I don't know if the president has the wherewithal to get something through the Congress quick enough to meet the dire and immediate requirements of the Palestinian people. But it is something, as the governor has said, is something that requires immediate response and activity.
At the back, the lady. Yeah.
I have a question for Prince Turki. I want to know, when will women be allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia?
This would seem one that would be easy to do, but, Your Royal Highness, why don't you just let them drive? You'll stop all these questions.
Indeed, and for me, they can drive from now. They have my permission to go and drive. But this is being facetious. I think it's not an issue of issuing edicts or regulations. It's an issue of social constriction in that case. And I'll just give you an example. Who is the most prized woman today in Saudi Arabia? She is a woman with a job. 10, 20 years ago, the head of a household, usually a man, would have considered it to be shameful for a woman in his family or someone close to him that would have to go out and seek financial gain from a job or something like that, because through his upbringing and through his practice and through all of the cultural baggage that he has on him, he feels responsible to provide the livelihood for that woman. But in the last 15 years, the woman, because they acquired education and acquired ambition and independence and so on, they have gone out and brought more money to the family. And it's become a boon for some family members that their wives or daughters or sisters or cousins can bring in money, so on. So along with being the most popular in terms of family-wise also, the woman with a job is most popular with suitors. Many people want to marry her in order to get more income for that. And this change took place not because of religious fatwa or government edict. It took place because of social progress and social needs. And I think I'll give you another story. There is one woman that I know of in Saudi Arabia that has a driver's license. She, before she got the driver's license, she was living with her father in a remote village in the southern, one of the southern provinces in Saudi Arabia. And one night, the chief of police called the governor, and he said, "We have arrested a woman who's been driving. What do we do with her?" And the governor told him, "Do with her what your regulations say." And he said, "We don't have any regulations. So what do we do?" So the governor asked her to come to his office, and when she came, he asked her, "Why were you driving?" She said, "My father had a heart attack, and I was the only one in the house, so I got in the car and drove him to the hospital. And that's how I got arrested." And the next day, he issued an order to give her a license. I think it takes two things for administrative and bureaucratic people of responsibility to have the courage like this governor to do something like that. And the other thing, I think, is that our women also have to have the courage and the wherewithal to go and demand that they get licenses and so on. They haven't done that yet.
All right. I can't see very well, but I think there's at the back there, there's a lady. Hand up there. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Obi Ezekwesili, and I'm from Nigeria. I'm a member of cabinet in Nigeria. I'd just like to ask President Karzai a question that's got to do with this concept of democracy not being an end in itself. There's always this level of disenchantment that envelopes people when after a democratic process, the economy just doesn't deliver. And for most people, in some environments where we have weak governance institutions, that can be a reason for a backlash in terms of consolidating democracy. How much of this are you discovering in your governance of Afghanistan? Thank you.
Weak government, huh? Well, I'm discovering a lot about weak government, ma'am. The democracy works better where people want it most, and works better where people can practice it most. Now, 4 years ago, when Afghanistan began its new journey towards a better life, when we allowed all the relevant institutional frameworks that would strengthen democracy, we saw, ma'am, an immense mushrooming of the institutions that would strengthen democracy. The press, for example, where we 4 years ago didn't have more than 4 or 5 government-run papers. Today we have 300 papers in 3 years all around the country. We had one government TV channel that didn't function well at all. Today we have, competing with this government channel, 5 private channels. And the worst is the government channel of all these channels. The private ones are doing very, very well. All other aspects, business, enterprise, is doing better than the government. So one of the good things, the blessings of democracy is that it unleashes the enterprise in man. By man, I mean mankind, not man or woman. So unleashes the enterprise in individuals. And we saw that function very well in Afghanistan. Of course, institutional strength, the state institutional strengths, with a capable, efficient, clean, non-corrupt, by that I mean clean government, is essential also very much to promote democracy and to keep people's hope in a democratic future. Bad governments can cause a bad spell on democracy, and I hope we can avoid it in Afghanistan, where we have some of the problems that weak governments have. Having said this, if you're satisfied, ma'am, with the answer, there are 2 more points, Mr. Zakaria, if you allow me,
Sure.
that I have in mind for democracy and for peace in our region that I would like to talk about. Afghanistan suffered because of intervention and invasion, but also because the invasion and intervention brought to our country a number of armed political parties and groups. And the presence of these armed groups again became new instruments for intervention from abroad to damage and destroy our country. The fighting between themselves and the fight against foreigners was what caused so much misery and destruction in Afghanistan. So the collection of arms and depositing of arms in the hands of state institutions is an extremely important component for stability and peace and statehood in any country. To Hamas and to the Palestinian Authority, I see on television armed groups roaming around the streets of Ramallah or other parts of the Palestinian Authority. Is extremely important to disarm and collect arms from all the groups and put them into the legitimate Palestinian Authority. Other than that, the Palestinian people will suffer at the hands of these groups. On another question, this is an advice from an experience that we have as citizens of Afghanistan. On another question with regard to women in Saudi Arabia, our sister lady asked a question here. I was in Saudi Arabia about a month and a half ago attending the Islamic Summit Conference. I was interviewed, ma'am, by a Saudi woman journalist for the Saudi television, a very eloquent, very aware, highly educated woman who confronted me in the halls of the hotel where I was staying and said, I need an interview with you, and she came. So there is a lot happening in Saudi Arabia that His Highness did not speak about out of modesty. There is a lot of women participation. As a matter of fact, this is the 2nd time that I've been interviewed by a Saudi woman journalist in Saudi Arabia. That's not a secret, I hope. Your Highness. No,
it's not a secret.
Sir, up front there. Just don't give them Prince Turki's number.
My question is to Governor Owens. Are we going to see one day the end of the double standard which the United States practice? Because on one side, they say they are after the welfare, just, fair, etc. And they are following the resolution 1559 for Lebanon. Minister Salami is here, to the end. Fine. Why don't they follow also the resolution 242 and 338 regarding the Palestinian issue, especially that in Lebanon, the Arab Summit endorsed complete recognition to Israel for complete peace. So this double standard, when is going to be ended? Second question.
No, just one question. Thank you. Governor.
The question was about an alleged American double standard regarding Israel. And while I'm not specifically familiar with each of those resolutions, I do recall that in some cases the United States was on the losing side of the resolution. But here's the important point, and it's more to the topic of this discussion. The United States does believe in democracy. We do understand that it's imperfect. We do understand that it has to be adapted to national and indigenous means and purposes. It's not going to be top-down, generally speaking, except when you've had a defeated country, as in Japan or Germany, where democracies were imposed, and they were imposed successfully following defeat. Israel's not perfect, and the Prince's comment earlier was appropriate. Israel makes mistakes, and I understand that, and I hope most Americans understand that. But also, those on the other side of Israel have made it very easy for Israel to be considered a victim in the United States. Because when you see the terrorist bombings, when you see the innocent people murdered, it's hard to worry about Resolution 442 or 338. So here's my advice to both sides. End the terrorism and start to let the people make these decisions. And Israel's obviously a democracy, and it's a raucous, I mean, I've been in the Knesset, and I've seen how its democracy works sometimes. But let's just try to reduce the level of violence, let the people make their choices, and then the U.S. won't be in this difficult position of having sometimes to deal between friends like Saudi Arabia and Jordan on the one hand and Israel on the other.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. I'm looking for a, there. Sure.
I'm Shobna Bhartiya from India. I'm a publisher. This question is again to Governor Owens. I wanted to ask you about the double standards in America's foreign policy. On the one hand, America prides itself in trying to spread democracy by any means, sometimes questionable, at the cost of denting institutions as well. On the other hand, it's now made Pakistan its ally in the war against terror. It props up a government which is not democratic. I'm not trying to compare it with many other countries. Pakistan has been vacillating between democracy and dictatorship. It props up a government, the constitutional amendments are brought in. It even bombs certain parts of the country because it believes that they're hiding Al-Qaeda and Taliban there. How do you explain this double standard, and yet you support and prop up a government like that? How do you explain the double standards in the foreign policy where you're propping up governments which are very obviously not democratic?
Well, I'll be glad to discuss that issue, and it's a very fair question, and I won't assume I won't agree with your supposition, though I understand the confusion. We all understand, I think, where the India, Pakistan, United States, Soviet, where those blocks over a period of 20 and 30 years developed. That's now over. But Pakistan has been, in fact, trying to help in the international fight against terrorism. And the United States is not a country that says we only will deal with pure democracies. The United States is not a country that says you have to be a pure democracy in our standard or we will not deal with you. We have a mutual aim with Pakistan at this point in time, and that is to defeat Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is an enemy to Pakistan, and it's an enemy to the United States. My country was criticized throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s for working sometimes with countries that were less than pure in terms of democracy. And our motive then, I believe, was pure. We were trying to confront a larger challenge to the world called the Soviet Union. Now that that is no longer a challenge, we're truly trying to push democracy. We're criticized for it. But the reason why is pretty simple. Democratic countries don't fight one another. think about throughout history, has there ever been one time when real democracies waged war on each other? And that's a great fundamental premise that drives American foreign policy. Democracies are better typically than countries which aren't. I understand Pakistan is not a democracy. I understand that, that it is evolving, but in fact it's very controversial. But we also understand that Pakistan and President Musharraf, at great personal courage, is trying to move closer into being part of the community of nations, and he is doing an outstanding job in fighting international terrorism, which is a threat to many of our countries.
Well, with that, all is left is to thank the panel for very, very eloquent presentations. Thank you all. Thank you.